Welcome to my podcast, The Government Mechanic. I am your host, Dr. Lynn Sandra Kahn, and I am the Government Mechanic. This is episode 14 for strategic planners only, and I hope you will consider this a masterclass in strategic planning. Here to talk about these plans and roadmaps is Kathleen Monahan, and together we have about 65 years of experience doing strategic planning and management consulting inside the federal government. In this episode 14, I'm going to walk you through 9 different strategic plans and roadmaps, starting with reinventing government in 1992, up through the work I'm doing with farmers and our food supply in 2025. I will walk through these for the podcasters or people that are listening to the podcast. The graphics for this episode 14 on my YouTube channel, The Government Mechanic, gives a more complete picture. So let's look at that first slide. Okay, as this cover slide shows, this episode is taken from a presentation that I did called 7 Lessons from Juvenile Justice Reform. I did this presentation in June 2024, and I do want to thank again the Association for Conflict Resolution Greater New York chapter for giving me the opportunity to pull my thoughts together after many years and speak. And I especially want to thank Elise Branchow for her support and guidance. Next slide. Well, just to give you the big picture, I'll show you the 7 lessons, but I'm really going to focus on lesson 1. You got to have a plan. Lesson 2, the rest of these, I think if you're doing strategic planning, you certainly already know. Lesson 2 is leadership matters. Lesson 3, deep and broad partnerships are key. Lesson 4, support the hidden ecosystem of the communities we serve. There is, in every community we serve, a hidden ecosystem of leadership. Find that ecosystem, support it, and as lesson 5 says, invest in it. Invest in community-based services, supports, and opportunities. Measure outcomes. And lesson 7, one that I have to learn over and over again, more humility, please. Next slide. So lesson 1, you got to have a plan. And I'm beginning to say, and a roadmap all in one sentence. You got to have a plan and a roadmap. Here's the list of the 9 different strategic plans and roadmaps I'm going to talk about, but I'm not going to read them because I will comment on each one in turn. Next slide. Reinventing government, 1992 to 2000. On the right of the slide, you see a famous picture, I think, of a very young Al Gore presenting to a very young Bill Clinton the first set of reinventing government reports and recommendations. In the background, you can see a forklift filled with just bureaucratic nonsense, impossible to understand manuals and policies and all kinds of gobbledygook. And on the left, in the middle, is the cover of the Blair House Papers, which became pretty much the strategic plan for reinvention a couple of years after we started. On the left, you see that the plan to reinvent all of the federal government was divided into 3 high-level goals: deliver great service, build partnerships, and find community solutions, and then reinvent agencies. Reinvention was where I began to learn about strategic planning. And the point I want to make is that reinvention took this huge vision for transforming all of the federal government and translated it into a clear statement of 3 goals and 9 strategies. So you can see it just all on one page. And in fact, the goals and strategies are listed on one page. And 30 years later, I still insist in strategic plans that all of the goals and strategies should be outlined on one page. Next slide. Reinventing government also taught me how important visual learning is to communicate new ideas. And this slide is a transformation roadmap for reinventing government. And it was a drawing done by the amazing Jan Jamil, I think about 1993. Across the top, you see the key questions of any transformation. Where are we now? Where are we going? What does success look like? What do we measure? And by now, reinvention was divided into 3 clusters of activities related to leadership, customer focus, and the new federal workforce. What stands out in this drawing of essentially America with coastlines and mountains and prairies and farmland and cities, what stands out is this huge gap, really a gash across the middle, labeled public distrust of government. And I wonder if 33 years later, it's possible to rebuild that trust. So I think the big lesson here is that goals, strategies, actions, timelines, measures can be portrayed on a one-page graphic or drawing. And it helps to have this visual tool when you want people to start understanding a new direction. Next slide. This is a slide represents a 1994 Cleveland Summit on Violence, and I talked about this in episode 12, and I'm not going to repeat myself. I just want to highlight 4 observations because these are practices that 30 years later I'm still doing. I do the same kind of 3 basic questions when I'm designing a town hall meeting, a citywide summit, listening tours, surveys, interviews. It's all some version of what's working, what's not working, and what else do you want me to know? Pretty straightforward. And don't underestimate the power of that question. What else do you want us to know? I was astonished at the summit, the kinds of things that people were telling us were going on in their neighborhoods. Very detailed. The second point I want to make is there is a process, especially when you're doing complicated strategic planning. So here there were 6 town halls around the city before the citywide summit, which was endorsed and co-led by the mayor, the chief of police, and the president of the city council. And we had 1,000 people sitting at 100 tables in one of 14 different topic areas, answering the questions: what are the most important short-term actions, midterm actions, long-term actions, and what else do you want us to know? I guess what I want to say, looking back on all this, timing matters. What happened? Because this was it was a great design. The mayor, the police chief, the president of the city council opened the summit. They were there. They were actively involved. What happened? The mayor lost the next election, and the chief of police did try to keep it together and support the recommendations we turned in our report. But the politics were missing. And that's just, you can't do big change unless the leadership really lines up and the politics are right. And that's maybe the last lesson for this. Big change, real reinvention, real transformation means leadership across agencies. And whether you're talking about the mayor, the governor, or the president, leadership has to line up around mission, vision, goals, priorities, and measures. And that's the only way to ensure that you're on the right track. I'm going to pause for a minute. Kathy, do you want to add anything to what we've been saying?
Yeah, I do. What you said is very true. It is also true when you're doing planning for the government or for a government agency. You can't do your planning in a vacuum. You've got to talk to the people who are actually going to be doing the work, know what they need to do their job. In virtually every case, they know what they have to do. They just don't know how to get it done because they don't have the leadership support to do it. And I think that's where the strategic planning comes into play.
Yep. I think that was part of the power of that Cleveland Summit and other plans that I'll talk about. We had input from 1,000 people. There are 1,000 people identifying what actions needed to happen. So there was a lot of engagement and a lot of participation. And I agree, government agencies often don't do that. Okay, go ahead. Something else?
Yeah, because the first agency I did strategic planning with was HUD. And
housing and urban development.
Sorry, you're right. I make that mistake a lot. Yes, housing and urban development. And while leadership may have had sort of the big picture of goals, there was a whole ecosystem, for want of a better term, at the lower levels who were actually doing the work, who could look at what the leadership was saying or the goals and say, I don't think we can do that. If you want
Yep.
us to do that, this has to happen first. They were invaluable. When you're doing planning, don't ignore them.
Yes. Next slide. Okay, after Al Gore lost the 2000 election and reinventing government was over, I was still a federal employee, and I got to go back to my home agency, the Federal Aviation Administration. And thankfully, I was assigned to a really wonderful new boss, Mike Harrison, and I got to work on the Federal Aviation Administration's plan. They called it an operational evolution plan to talk about how our airspace up there, for our listeners, I'm pointing airspace up there, how our airspace would be evolving or changing over the 10 years from 2001 to 2010. And one of the two key issues, one was by the late 1990s, lots of people wanted to fly to a lot more places, and there were a lot of constraints. There was a real capacity issue. So the question was what new technologies and what changes need to happen, and how could they be coordinated across all the different agencies, airlines, industries that fly in our airspace. And that was the plan. So one was how to deal with this growing demand for flying. And the other was at the same time, aviation was transitioning from ground-based radar to satellite-based communication, navigation, and surveillance. So the biggest point that I want to make, can we go back to that slide? Even the most complicated transformations, and certainly what was going on with aviation as all those transitions were happening, the technology transitions were happening, was pretty complex. So you had all these levels of partnerships, some of whom were competitors, right? Because the airlines were part of this conversation. The new technologies are changing just about every day. Consumers are demanding louder and louder, more ability to fly to more places. But even that set of complicated issues can be organized into one page. And I want to direct your attention to the cover of the plan. So this slide shows the cover of the National Airspace System Operational Evolution Plan. And the big graphic in the middle, taking up most of that cover, shows how this whole issue is divided into 4 strategic domains: arrivals and departures, en route congestion, airport weather, and en route weather. And there's a lovely pictures that kind of match those 4 domains on the cover of the report. So the point I want to make is you actually can understand a huge amount of what's going on with this plan by looking at the one page of this cover. And at the time, the Department of Defense required a one-page graphic of whatever project any office or team wanted to get funding for. So if you wanted to get funding for something in the Department of Defense, you would have a one-page graphic called the OV1, the Operational View 1, and that would convey the essence of what it was your project was about. So we're all used to, for many, many years, summarizing things on one page. I'm going to go to the next slide and then bring Kathy back in. So this is a slide. This slide is the National Airspace System, that evolution plan, a roadmap, a graphical roadmap, a visual roadmap that pulls together the key elements of what was going to change over those 10 years. And there's 2 or 3 points that I want to make about this. One is that you cannot have a strategic plan without some kind of implementation roadmap. Plans and roadmaps. You can't just deliver a plan. You have to have some sense of what the roadmap is about. And people use the phrase roadmap and the word roadmap in a lot of different ways. So it could be very detailed, like an engineering roadmap, which would have lots and lots of technical layers. Or it could be what's on that slide, if you could bring us back to that slide. Thank you. A beautiful drawing that pulls together, this one done by the talented David Sibbett, that has sections for what are the user needs, what does 21st century aviation look like? This was done in 1995. So what are the key themes of the next century in aviation? What are the new benefits? What kinds of assumptions do we need to be really clear about if we're going to make big funding decisions? And then on the right of this pull-out graphic were sections for different services needed to fly in the airspace, like weather alerts and some other things. But we literally used this graphic, 2 pages of graphics at a 2-day conference with aviation engineers and system engineers to help them understand, it's back to what Kathy was talking about before, exactly that all the working levels, that the engineers that were actually going to do the work and the air traffic controllers would understand what the new technologies were and how they were going to evolve together in a coordinated way over 10 years. And again, I think the other point is visual. People are visual learners. So putting the information into as visual and graphical a form as possible is incredibly important. Kathy,
Yes.
anything you want to add?
It's just, you have to make sure it's concise and clear. You don't want them to get lost in the details.
Mm-hmm.
You want to be able to address the details, but the big picture should be what's up on the screen. Because otherwise they stop listening to you and start like reading the page rather than listening to you.
We didn't do it like that. We divided them up into the groups according to the kinds of work that they did.
Oh,
So the weather
okay,
people
well,
went one place, and the engineers, the air traffic controllers went a different place. And then they would just focus on one part of that graphic.
Right.
Because we didn't need people to go through the whole thing. It's too complicated. Okay, next slide. The next slide, New York City Department of Probation. This is a strategic plan from 2012. I also worked on the one for 2011. This strategic plan is really powerful in terms of both impact, crime and violence went down, and it was groundbreaking. There are many elements in here that have just carried on, and as the people that are active in the field of justice reform, literally running the jails and prisons and detention centers where people are held, who are trying to transform their systems. When you come up with a plan to do that transformation, in justice reform, you see the same 4 or 5 strategic goals. So the first one always has to be safer communities. If you're working in justice, the first goal is always safety. The second goal is actually doing the work of the organization more directly. Having better programs, more opportunities, more resources, more services. An innovation element that I want to pull out is for goal 2, and it's strategy 3. Establish a neighborhood opportunity network. And we called them the NEONs, Neighborhood Opportunity Network. And the goal was to put a neon in each of the boroughs of New York City so that people that are on probation, juveniles and adults on probation, didn't have to travel across boroughs to meet with their probation officer. So these were hubs of services. The probation officers could be there. And there are many other training, education, community development, work development opportunities that were based in these hubs. And it became a very important element of how good practices and good news and good information circulated in the neighborhoods. The other goals, once you just focus on safety and then the programs that are being delivered, for me, the other goals all have to do with organizational excellence, and sometimes they're pulled out in different ways. So in this version, organizational excellence was goal 3. Goal 4 was strong partnerships and community engagement. And goal 5 was measuring success. So depending on local concerns, partnerships or measuring results or community input might be pulled out separately or kept into a larger goal called organizational excellence. Kathy, anything to add?
Not in that particular slide, no.
All right. We're on to the next one. And this is the New York City Department of Homeless Services, work I did in 2014, 2015. And the slide shows the workbook for the executive offsite. There was a 2-day offsite, and the purpose was to confirm a draft vision, mission, set of goals, and set of priorities. And one thing I want to say is I always have some kind of a workbook that I hand out in events, planning events, even as big as that 1,000 person summit in Cleveland, Ohio. There's so much going on, and there's so many dynamics and so many different kinds of interactions, and especially if you're doing violence and crime and violence, reducing crime and violence, that people literally and psychologically need something to hold on to. And I always have a workbook so that they know where the beginning is, they know where the end is, they know the boundaries of, where the breaks are, what the sessions are about, who's going to be at what session. So having a workbook is really important. There are three points. Can we go back to the homeless services? There are 3 points that I want to make about this. First, the goals are really, really clear. They had 7: prevention, outreach, shelter, aftercare, and permanency, permanent housing planning, organizational excellence, partnerships, and performance measures. Beginning to sound a little familiar. I want to make 2 more points. One is that I was really impressed with this executive leadership team. I think sometimes as consultants, we come into planning and implementation work and we underestimate how much knowledge exists in the system. And often our job is to pull together those pieces so that there is a brilliant and a coherent plan. The first morning of this offsite included a very profound conversation about the power of preventing homelessness, leading to the importance of goal number 6 about partnerships. But what I learned was that far too many people are released from institutions into homelessness, and like being released from foster care or the military or prison or jail or detention of any kind, and they end up homeless. So prevention is key and cannot be accomplished without true partnerships. I'm good. Ready for the next one. I did very little with this one, but was there for a few meetings. And I think it's fabulous. This is the New York City Mayor's Office of Criminal Justice. It's, again, a very clearly written statement of vision, mission, priorities, and strategies. Here, the goals are called priorities. And again, the priorities and the strategies are summarized on one page. And bless their heart, priority number 1, improve public safety. Priority 2, safely reduce unnecessary incarceration. Priority 3, promote fairness. And priority 4, strengthen the justice system coordination. On the next slide, we see the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services, work I did in 2023 on their strategic plan for 2024 to 2028. And by now, the strategic goals should look very familiar. Goal number 1, improve public safety. Yay. Goal number 2, improve youth outcomes. Goal number 3, build partnerships to improve all outcomes. And goal number 4, achieve organizational excellence. I want to hone in on strategy 2 for goal number 1. And the strategy says, create an intensive intervention for youth at risk of gun violence involvement. This plan and priorities, and especially these strategies, really were developed by people who understood best practices in juvenile justice reform. And those best practices are reflected in this strategy. The first bullet talks about the YES, Youth Engagement and Strategies for Safety Improvement Team. An improvement team is what the Secretary Schiraldi took to the Maryland Department of Juvenile Services from work that we did maybe 10 and 15 years ago. An improvement team is a short-term problem-solving group specifically commissioned to identify, in this case, ways to reduce the impact of gun violence on young people in Maryland. So again, this was another way, kind of what Kathy's been talking about, bringing in more input from more people so that the policies actually make sense. And the second bullet points to the launch of the Thrive Academy. This was an intensive program for young people who were thought to be vulnerable to gun violence. And they were given wrapped around services, mentors, and many different kinds of supports and opportunities. In Baltimore, juvenile crime is going down, violence is going down. In Maryland, statewide, juvenile crime is going down. These strategies are working. There is in place a network throughout this country and around the world that are understanding what needs to happen to help young people caught up in our justice system turn their lives around. And a lot of it has to do with treating them as children who need resources, supports, opportunities, and mentors. Okay, closing out here, our next slide. So I went from 2023 doing that juvenile justice reform work to something healthier in some ways, independent food processing. And so I'm back to working with some of those farmers that you've met in episodes 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. And that's it. 9 different strategic plans and roadmaps. I hope you've learned something. Is there anything you want to add here, Kathy?
No, not really in this sense. But, like I said before, you got to have a plan. You can't just be sitting up at the top of the organization thinking, well, it would be nice if all of these things over here happened, without communicating with the employees, the people who are actually doing the job, and the people who are impacted by the people doing the job.
Well said, and a perfect note to end on. Thank you. And we are taking a week off, and we'll be back with season 3, episode 15 in 2 weeks. Thank you.